The most terrifying aspect of this story isn't that a three-legged creature with glowing pink eyes terrorized a small Illinois town. It's that multiple witnesses saw it, police found its tracks, and to this day, no one can explain what it actually was. Viewer discretion is advised. But before we dive into today's cryptid mystery, if you're fascinated by unexplained creatures and paranormal encounters, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you don't miss our new uploads. We upload new videos 2 to 3 times every week. Now let's begin. April 25th, 1973 was supposed to be a quiet evening in Enfield, Illinois, a small town of fewer than 700 residents nestled in the rural farmland of White County. For 11-year-old Greg Garrett, it started like any other night, finishing homework, doing chores, eating dinner with his family, and then heading outside to feed the dogs before bedtime. The routine was always the same, and nothing unusual ever happened in their peaceful neighborhood. But on this particular night, as Greg scooped kibble into the dog bowls behind his house, he heard a strange rustling sound in the darkness. At first, when he turned around, Greg saw nothing unusual, just a few fireflies floating in the warm spring air and the neighbor's cat flickering its tail across the street. But as he turned back to finish feeding the dogs, the rustling sounds returned, more aggressive this time. When he whipped around to see what was making the noise, something struck him with tremendous force, knocking him off his feet. Terrified and unable to see clearly in the darkness, Greg scrambled to get up and ran toward the house, barely escaping as something clawed at his feet just as he burst through the door. Greg burst into the living room, hysterically crying, telling his parents about the attack. His mother and father immediately examined him for injuries, and while they found significant rips and tears in his tennis shoes, as if something had tried to shred them with claws, they were relieved to discover no physical wounds. Greg's parents knew their son wasn't one to make up stories, and he was clearly shaken by whatever had happened. But because it was completely dark outside and Greg couldn't provide a clear description of what he'd encountered, his father concluded that he had probably stepped on a snake, which had recoiled and attacked in self-defense. What the Garrett family didn't know was that just 30 yards down the street, their neighbor Henry McDaniel was about to have an encounter that would transform their quiet town into the center of one of America's most bizarre cryptid cases. McDaniel, a disabled World War II veteran who had been raising his children in the neighborhood for years, was accustomed to the normal sounds of their area: the rumbling of trains on the nearby tracks, the daily traffic of school buses and commuters, and the usual neighborhood animals. Nothing strange had ever occurred in Enfield, and nothing newsworthy had ever made it to the local paper. That evening, Henry and his wife had been out running errands and arrived home around 9:30 p.m. to find their 3 children huddled together in the living room, frightened by scratching sounds that had been traveling from the front door to the back of the house for nearly 20 minutes. The children begged their father to investigate, but Henry initially dismissed their concerns, noting that the sounds had stopped when they arrived. However, their persistent pleas eventually convinced him to promise that after dinner and bedtime preparations, he would take a flashlight and walk the perimeter of the house to put their minds at ease. At approximately 9:45 p.m., Henry reluctantly grabbed his flashlight, unlocked the deadbolt, and began to turn the front door knob. He expected to find a neighborhood dog scratching at the door, or at worst, a bear that had wandered into their yard. Bears have been known to roam the area before. But when Henry opened the door, he was confronted by something that defied all explanation and would haunt him for the rest of his life. Standing on his front stoop was a creature unlike anything Henry had ever seen or imagined. As he would later tell reporters, it had 3 legs on it, a short body, 2 little short arms, and 2 pink eyes as big as flashlights. It stood 4.5 feet tall and was grayish colored. The creature's eyes, which Henry described as being about 3 inches apart and looking like truck reflectors, stared directly back at him with an otherworldly intensity. The beast appeared to have a round head sitting directly on a torso, covered in gray fur, and its overall appearance was almost like a human body, but grotesquely distorted. Terrified by this nightmarish sight, Henry quickly slammed the door shut and ran across the house to grab his .22 rifle and a flashlight. Within seconds, he was back outside, firing at the creature. He shot 4 times, missing with each shot, but the creature's reaction was even more disturbing than its appearance. With every gunshot, the beast made a hissing sound that Henry described as being much like a wildcat or like a cottonmouth snake. Even more remarkably, each miss caused the monster to take 3 enormous leaps through the air, covering approximately 75 feet with each bound before disappearing into the shadows near the railroad embankment. Henry immediately called the police, and as he later recalled, the state police had somebody here in a hurry. When officers arrived to investigate, they found Henry to be rational and sober in his reporting of the incident. More importantly, they discovered physical evidence that corroborated his extraordinary story. In the soft earth around Henry's house, investigators found several footprints that resembled a dog's paw, but with 6 toe pads instead of the normal 4. 2 of the tracks measured 4 inches wide. Police also discovered a series of scratches on the house's siding and found patches of gray fur caught in nearby bushes. The evidence was undeniable. Something unusual had been at the McDaniel residence that night. But what made the case even more intriguing was the connection to young Greg Garrett's earlier encounter. When investigators interviewed neighbors, they learned about Greg's attack just 30 minutes before Henry's sighting. The timing and proximity suggested that the same creature had terrorized both the Garrett and McDaniel families in a single evening. The story might have ended there, dismissed as an isolated incident involving a wild animal. But Henry McDaniel wasn't finished with the Enfield monster, and it wasn't finished with him. 2 weeks later, on May 6th, Henry called radio station WWKI at 3 a.m., claiming to have seen the creature again. This time, he spotted it negotiating the railroad trestles near his home. As Henry described it, "I saw something moving out on the railroad track, and there it stood. I didn't shoot at it or anything. It started on down the railroad track. It wasn't in a hurry or anything. The creature seemed almost casual in its movements, as if it belonged there." This second sighting prompted WWKI's news director, Rick Rainbow, to organize a search party to investigate the area. Rainbow, who had driven 4 hours from Kokomo, Indiana, was determined to discover the truth behind these bizarre reports. What happened next would either validate Henry's claims or expose them as elaborate hoaxes. Rainbow and his team spent several days in Enfield, and during their investigation, they reported their own encounter with the creature. According to Rainbow and his companions, they spotted a strange-looking creature about 5.5 feet tall, with gray fur, hunched over and running at an unnatural speed near an abandoned building close to McDaniel's house. Although the creature vanished quickly, they managed to capture its shrieking cry on their tape recorder. Rainbow later described the sound as resembling that of an ape and was convinced there was truth to Henry's story. As Rainbow noted, "I was down there about 4 times and I heard Henry give the same story to over 200 reporters. Each time, he stuck with the same story, never changing it." The recording Rainbow made has since been lost, but at the time, it provided crucial evidence that something unusual was indeed happening in Enfield. Cryptozoologist Loren Coleman, who investigated the case, reported having a similar experience where he heard something that resembled Rainbow's tape, describing both sounds as similar to those made by a chimpanzee. As news of the Enfield monster spread through local and national media, the small town was inundated with curiosity seekers, monster hunters, and reporters. The story appeared in newspapers throughout Illinois on April 27, 1973, and by May 7th, Henry was being interviewed on Chicago's WGN radio station. Articles appeared in the Chicago Daily News, the Moline Dispatch, and newspapers across the Midwest. The attention brought both fame and trouble to Enfield. On May 8th, just one day after Henry's radio interview, police were called to investigate reports of gunfire and arrested 5 young men from out of town who had come to Enfield hoping to photograph the creature. Armed with shotguns and rifles for protection, the men claimed to have sighted the beast in the woods. However, the White County Sheriff dismissed their monster hunting expedition as an exaggeration, saying the men were just out drinking and raising hell, and had mentioned the monster only briefly during questioning. The men were charged with hunting violations. The sheriff's dismissive attitude reflected the growing tension in Enfield between believers and skeptics. Local law enforcement, led by the White County Sheriff's Department, wanted to keep the story quiet and threatened Henry with arrest if he continued sharing his account. As one deputy stated, "There ain't a thing to it. This thing has been promoted beyond reason. I've done my best to get Henry locked up." The sheriff was particularly concerned about armed outsiders coming to town, fearing they might accidentally shoot residents or livestock. But what exactly had Henry McDaniel and the others encountered? Several theories emerged to explain the Enfield monster. The most mundane suggestion was that it was an escaped kangaroo. The three legs description could be explained by a kangaroo's tail, which can appear like a third leg. This theory gained credence when an Ohio man named Alan Yorkshire contacted local newspapers, claiming the creature might be his pet kangaroo Macy, which had been lost or stolen a year earlier. However, Henry firmly rejected this explanation, noting that he had owned a kangaroo as a pet during his military service in Australia and knew what they looked like. Kangaroo tracks have claw marks, and a kangaroo has a narrow face. This wasn't a kangaroo, he insisted. Cryptozoologist Loren Coleman proposed a more intriguing theory. Coleman, who was studying at Southern Illinois University at the time, had recently completed research on wild apes in North America. He suggested that the Enfield monster might be an escaped or wild primate, possibly a chimpanzee. Coleman's theory was supported by the creature's described behavior, the ape-like sounds recorded by Rick Rainbow, and historical reports of similar creatures in the Mississippi River region dating back to 1941. Interestingly, just 40 miles away in Mount Vernon, Illinois, similar sightings of a leaping beast had occurred between 1941 and 1942, with witnesses describing a vaguely baboon-like creature capable of jumping 20 to 40 feet in a single bound. Despite the various theories, Henry McDaniel remained convinced that what he encountered was something beyond conventional explanation. In his final statement to the press, he declared, "If they do find it, they will find more than one, and they won't be from this planet. I can tell you that." Henry believed he had witnessed something extraterrestrial, and no amount of skepticism could change his mind. The Enfield monster case was later studied by researchers at Western Illinois University as an example of social contagion and collective behavior. However, their academic analysis couldn't explain away the physical evidence. The unusual footprints, the scratches on Henry's house, the gray fur found in bushes, and the multiple witness accounts. Today, nearly 50 years later, the Enfield monster remains one of America's most compelling cryptid cases, a reminder that some mysteries resist easy explanation and continue to challenge our understanding of what might be lurking in the shadows of small-town America.